Welcome back. We're continuing on in Science 4 in Chapter 3, learning about plants. And today we're going to be talking about the seed, which is very, very important. Without a seed, we couldn't reproduce plants. But before we get into our lesson today, if you look in your book on page 59, there's an activity that you can do at home. And it asks you to collect different fruits. And I suggested to my students to collect 5 fruits, cut them in half, and take a photograph of each fruit that you collected. And then to take out the seed and count the seeds that are in that fruit. And then put an example of the seed next to the fruit or the picture that you took. And then label it, this is a cherry. And then how many seeds you counted in that fruit. Then take one of those fruits that you collected and write 5 facts about that fruit. Now, for instance, a fact could be, how tall does this plant grow? At what temperature does the seed germinate? Things like that. You can make this poster as colorful as you want, but it's a good project to do to learn more about seeds. So we're going to get into our lesson. It starts on page 56 and it will go through page 58. And I have on the board some pictures. You're probably very familiar with them. We have an acorn, an apple, and we have what we call an acorn squash. It's just the shape of this particular squash. They all look very different, but there's one thing that is common or the same about all 3 of these. Can you guess what they are? Or guess what that one common thing is? Well, if you didn't know, each one of these is considered a fruit. Now you say, wait a minute, Mrs. Johnson, that doesn't sound right. That's an acorn, this is a squash. I always thought squash was a vegetable. Well, according to the definition, or our science definition of a fruit, it's not just an apple or an orange or something sweet that we enjoy to eat. A fruit is something that comes from a flowering plant, and that flower contains a seed, the fruit contains a seed. So if you look at how this plant grows, before the squash begins to grow, first a flower had to be formed. And then inside that flower, seeds were made because it was pollinated. And then once it's pollinated, the petals fall off of the flower. And then the fruit begins to grow, which is actually the squash. And inside you have all of those seeds. So this is considered a fruit according to our science definition. But that's an interesting thing to learn about these different seeds and fruits and different plants. Some things that we think are vegetables are actually fruit. You need to do a little bit of research to see which one is which. Let me ask you a question. Do you think a tomato is a vegetable or a fruit? You decide. Okay, let's get into our lesson today and we'll talk more about seeds. It says, once a flower is pollinated, its seeds begin to grow. A seed is the first stage in the growth of a plant. The plant may form a fruit around its seed. A fruit is a part of the flowering plant that contains or holds the seeds. Apples, oranges, cherries, and peaches are types of fruit, but so are acorns and hollyberries. God designed the fruit to protect the seeds while they grow. He also made many of the kinds of fruit to be food for us. Now, I want you to pay attention to this. Yes, we do eat a lot of fruit. It's very enjoyable to eat. For instance, one of my favorites is an apple. I enjoy eating apples. But what we think of as a fruit is not necessarily always a fruit. You have to be careful. What does the science definition say? But the most important part or the job of a fruit, is to protect the seed. And remember, without that seed, we cannot have these plants reproduce. So it's very important that the seed is protected. So God made the fruit to protect that seed. Now, many of those fruits, yes, we can eat and enjoy, but the most important part of a fruit is to protect the seed. So let's keep going. After seeds begin to grow, the other parts of the flower dry up and drop off or fall off. For example, an apple tree has beautiful white petals in the spring during pollination, but there are no flower petals on the trees when you pick the apples in the fall. And it gives you the two examples in your book of what an apple tree looks like in the spring, that's covered with beautiful white flowers, and then in the fall time, there are no flowers. Why? Because the petals have fallen off and it created a fruit. It's all now covered with apples in the fall time. So let's keep going. I forgot to mention here, we got some vocabulary words you want to pay attention to. Seed, that's what's needed to reproduce the plant. Disperse, and we'll get to that one later. And then we talked about fruit already. All right, the spreading of seeds. In order for a plant to reproduce, its seeds must find a place to grow. God gave plants many ways to disperse or spread their seeds, or meaning they need to find a place to grow. 3 ways seeds can disperse are by wind, water, and by animals or people. And we'll explain that in just a moment. Think about the apple tree. In the fall time, when you eat the apples or you pick the apples, if no one picks those apples, what would eventually happen to the apples on the tree? Well, over time, those apples will fall off. Now, if they fall off and hit the ground, over time, they will begin to decay or rot. And then eventually, those seeds might fall into the ground and maybe germinate and grow into a new apple tree. So the fruit is not meant to stay on the tree. Somehow, that seed has got to get someplace where it can grow and reproduce. So let's talk about that word disperse and the 3 different ways a seed can find a new place to grow. Seeds that are dispersed by the wind are lightweight. A dandelion seed is small and has tiny hairs. As the wind blows, it catches the hairs and lifts the seed up. The seed may float in the air for miles. A maple tree seed is contained in a fruit that twirls as it drops. The wind may then push it as far from the tree. I'll say that sentence again. The wind may then push it far enough from the tree so it has a better chance of survival or getting into the soil and germinating and to grow into a new tree. All right, so you have a picture here of a dandelion seed. Now, usually during the spring and summer, dandelions are yellow, but toward the fall time, they will begin to turn white. And I've always loved these. As a kid, I used to pick them and then blow on them, and what would happen? All of those little white things would just scatter everywhere. And then they would get into the soil and they would make new dandelions. Later, the following year, of course. These little seeds, and I'll try to find a space where you can see, right over here. I'll try to draw a picture of one of these seeds. It's got a long stick, and then on the end, that's the actual seed, that little knob at the bottom. But at the top, has these little hairs that kind of act like an umbrella. And so when the wind comes by, it'll catch that and then lift it and take it away to someplace else. And maybe you have seen this kind of seed. It mentions a maple tree seed. I'll try to draw it for you. Okay, so it's got these big wings here, kind of like wings. They're not really wings. But you may have seen this fall to the tree, fall from the tree, and it will spin in a circle. This is the actual part, is the actual seed that would go into the ground and possibly germinate to make a new maple tree seed, or make a new maple tree. So with seeds like that are very small or very lightweight, the wind usually takes them and disperses them or put them in a new place. Let's keep going. Some seeds are dispersed or moved by water. These seeds may travel great distances this way. A coconut is a huge seed. Its hard shell allows it to float for miles in the ocean before washing up on land. So another way seeds are dispersed or moved is by water, and it gives you an example of the coconut seed. The outside of the coconut is kind of like wood, and so it would float in water. The third way seeds are dispersed, is by animals or people. Squirrels eat acorns that fall from oak trees and bury some for later. In the winter, squirrels dig up and eat most of the buried acorns. But sometimes an acorn is buried and forgotten. A new oak tree may grow from this acorn. All right, so it gives you a little picture of a squirrel, and they're busy all summer long, not only eating different acorns, but they're collecting different acorns, and then they will bury them because they're preparing for the winter. And then when it's time to eat during the winter time, they will go and find what they've buried and eat most of them during the winter time. But sometimes some of them get left in the ground, and it may get into the soil and may germinate and make a new oak tree. So let's keep going. There are also seeds such as burrs or stick-tights that can catch a ride on animals and people. These seeds have hooks and pricks on them. The seeds can stick to an animal's fur. The animal transports the seeds to a new location. Sometimes even people transport these seeds. If you walk through a field, you may get these seeds stuck to your socks. When you pick them up and drop them on the ground, you are dispersing seeds. Now, I hated this, going through the woods or where there's a lot of plants and you're not paying attention, and I look down and there's these things sticking all over my legs. Sometimes they can be a little painful because they have sharp quills or thorns on them. But most of them you don't even pay attention to. But you look down and you see all of these seeds on your pants or your socks, and you stop and you pick them off and you throw them on the ground. Well, you just disperse the seeds or move them to a new location. So possibly they could go into the ground and reproduce after they germinate. So I don't know if maybe you've had a dog. I had a dog growing up, and when that dog got outside, it liked to run all over the place, and it will come back with all of these burrs in its fur, and it was so hard to get it out. But if they fall out naturally, or if a human helps it take it out of the fur of the animal, then we just throw it on the ground and we just disperse that seed. These burrs or stick tights kind of look like this. Okay, so this is kind of the shape of a stick tight. These are very sharp and they stick easily to somebody's clothes or an animal's fur. And down in this area, this is where the actual seed would be. Okay? And then maybe a burr would look more like this, kind of like a round shape in the middle, but there's all these little spikes sticking out of it. I don't know if you can see that from the camera's view. All these little spikes, and they stick really easily to an animal's fur. Okay? So that is an example of a burr. All right, let's go on to the next page, please. Page 58. Many seeds have tasty outer parts that are attractive to ants. The ants sometimes carry the seeds to their underground nests. They eat only the outer part and usually leave the seed unharmed. The seed is left in the ground, ready to start growing. So it mentions here ants. Ant is an insect, and they'll find seeds and they'll eat just the outside part of the actual fruit. And then what's inside is the seed, but they don't eat that part. And it just gets left, and possibly it can go into the soil and germinate and grow a new plant. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the parts of the seed. Seeds have three main parts. These parts are the seed coat, the developing plant, and the stored food. The seed coat is the outside covering around the seed. It protects stored food and the developing plant. The developing plant is the part of the seed that will become the new plant. Even in the seed, it has the beginnings of leaves, stems, and roots. Inside the seed coat, there is stored food for the developing plant to grow. All right, so I have a big picture here. I'll move my podium so you can see, and I'll erase our vocabulary words. We have a big picture of a seed. This is kind of what a bean seed would look like, maybe a lima bean, if I were to cut it in half. So, and I made it really big so you can see it. Most of it here is this section. And this is what we call our stored food. Now, there is a science word that is a better word to use than stored food, but we'll learn about that when you get into science grade 6. And it's called cotyledons, but you don't have to remember that. You can just remember that this is actually food for the little plant. And then we have this part that's the outside of the seed. So you have to remember, it's kind of like I cut it in half, so you're looking inside the seed. But this is the outside of the seed, and it's called the seed coat. And then lastly, this little part, and yes, every seed has this. It has a little immature or developing plant that has all the parts it needs that will become an adult plant. Now, the seed coat, this is really, really important. When it's cold outside, what do you wear? Well, obviously you wear a coat. Why? Because it protects your body from the cold. And that's the job of a seed coat. It protects the inside, especially this little developing plant. And then while it's in the ground and while it germinates and it begins to grow out of the soil, it's not ready to do photosynthesis, which uses sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to make food. It's not ready to do that yet. It's too young. So it needs something to grow. It needs some kind of nourishment. So it uses this part, the stored food, to feed this little plant. And when this little plant breaks out of the soil and is big enough, then it can start making its own food and it doesn't need this anymore. All right, so the three parts of a plant, let's say it with me. We have the seed coat, the outside, protects, kind of like an exoskeleton, what we learn about insects. Then we have the developing plant, which is all the parts of a little plant that are ready to grow as soon as it germinates. And then we have stored food. And this is what feeds this little plant until it's ready to make food on its own. And you can get a large seed, preferably one, a fresh seed might be easier to cut through. And look and see if you can find that little immature or developing plant. It would be interesting if you did a seed study on that. Before I close this lesson, let's go ahead and do a little review. We learned about the parts of the flower in our previous lesson. What were the three parts of the flower? Okay, we have the showy, colorful, usually that has the smell to it. That is the petal. And then we have the male part, which makes pollen. And without pollen, that flower could not reproduce. That is the stamen. That is the male part of the flower. And then in the middle, you have what is called the pistil, which is the female part. And inside the pistil, down at the very bottom, there are little tiny eggs. And when that pollen and egg meet, it makes a seed. And without that seed, it could not reproduce. So petal, stamen, which is male, and then pistil, which is female. And then we learned about the word pollination, which is the moving of pollen from the stamen to the pistil. And we learned that there were several kinds of pollination. There was self-pollination, when the stamen is higher than the pistil. We have wind pollination, where the pollen is blown, and usually grasses or wheat or corn, that is wind pollination that moves the pollen. Then we had animals, and we divided it into two. I know it says it's one in your book. We have insects and small animals, and they work together in a partnership. The insect or animal is getting food from the flower, and then the insect or animal is pollinating the flower so it can reproduce. Okay, very good. I will see you next time. I hope you enjoyed this, but before I go, you have a little bit of homework. There are 2 questions on page 58, and also activity manual 43 and 44. By the way, have you checked on your plant lately that has the one that's the dark seed and the one that's the light seed? Have they germinated yet? Leave a comment and tell me how that experiment is going. We'll see you next time.